Hi everybody, my name's Andrew and today I'm driving a Mk8 Volkswagen Golf GTI, a car which has become known around the world as the hot hatchback. Now in its 8th iteration since going on sale 40 years ago, is it still any good? Volkswagen has taken their typical evolutionary approach to redesigning this car. And today we're going to find out, is it still the best hot hatchback? On the outside at least, you'd be forgiven for mistaking this car for just a facelifted Mk7 GTI. While the whole exterior has technically been redesigned, some of the body lines have been made sleeker and honestly most of it's just a little bit rounder than the old car. This car is exactly the same size as the old one. I mean, the exterior dimensions are absolutely identical except for the height. It's actually about an inch lower than the old car, weirdly. In Autobahn form, the GTI features full LED head and taillights now, as well as 19-inch alloy wheels. However, this particular car does feature aftermarket clear Euro-style taillights with, as you can see, sequential turn signals, and a set of 21-inch wheels from a Volkswagen Atlas. It is also worth noting that base trims do still get LED lights all the way around, though the headlights are partial LED and a reflector design rather than adaptive projectors. One of my favorite things back here, as with the Golf has in previous iterations, is this rotating emblem right here, which both functions as the trunk release and hides the backup camera to keep it clean. Aside from the Autobahn, 2 other trim levels are available, S and SE. Although for 2024, Volkswagen is also adding a 380 edition, which effectively just marks the end of the manual transmission in this car. All versions, however, still feature the same drivetrain option, a 2-liter E888 turbocharged 4-cylinder, mated to either a 7-speed DSG or 6-speed manual, and front-wheel drive. In stock form, this engine puts out 241 horsepower and 273 foot-pounds of torque, which are respectable, but let's be honest, not over-the-top numbers in the hot hatch segment these days. Inside, the cabin of the new GTI feels overall pretty well put together and surprisingly upmarket, despite being filled with many cheap hard plastics in major areas. Though, to be fair, it is kind of hard to avoid cheap plastics in a car of this price point. However, this car is certainly heavy on them, mainly on the doors and lower dashboard. Although actually, frankly, the top of the dashboard too, if we're honest. On the other hand, a few things I like in here, one being the steering wheel, which as you can see has perforations along the side. It's also heated and super chunky and just feels great in hand. The shifter has a rubberized golf ball texture on the back, which is a nice little golf Easter egg there. And isn't my favorite manual shifter in the world, but we'll talk more about that later. The seats up front are super comfortable, and while they're not super customizable, the Autobahn trim does give you 4-way lumbar as well as 3-position memory. And the front seats also allow you to have the heating and ventilation running simultaneously, which is super nice. Aside from the heated steering wheel, many other modern features are now standard across the entire GTI range, including parking sensors on the outside, front and rear, as well as the digital gauge cluster that's right here in front of you. This being an Autobahn trim, as mentioned previously, brings additional features such as heads-up display, Harman Kardon sound system, a sunroof, heated rear seats, and a few others. However, adding all of these features does bring this car over the $40,000 mark, which is the first time, I believe, ever that the GTI has crossed that threshold. Undoubtedly, one of the largest pain points most commonly agreed on with the Mk8 is the interior controls. So let's talk about touch buttons and technology overall. Let's start with the infotainment system. Being an Autobahn, you get a 10-inch infotainment screen up here, as well as the digital gauge display that we mentioned previously. In this instance, you have a row of touch-sensitive climate controls along the bottom, which do have a few shortcuts for the heated seats and so on. But it does lack a traditional volume control of any kind, whether that's a knob or a toggle or anything. You do have this little slider and you can tap it here in the middle, but frankly that's just kind of annoying. On the base cars, however, specifically the base S, you get a smaller 8-inch screen, which for some reason takes away these climate controls, but then gives you a volume knob. Not really sure why Volkswagen decided to do that, and it just means that you effectively can't win, no matter which infotainment system you get. It's also worth noting that these climate buttons down here don't light up at night. Like, come on. They are basically invisible in the dark, which is really, really frustrating. So you either have to memorize where they are, or you simply have to pull up the climate menu on the screen and use that instead. And regardless of which infotainment system you get, the user interface is really just difficult in most ways, to be honest. The stock infotainment system, while it is pretty customizable, which I do like, effectively is just way too complicated. And it's quick enough, but I would personally just rather use Apple CarPlay because that's what everybody is mainly used to at this point anyway. The good news is the wireless CarPlay does work fairly well, unlike some other German products that I've tried. The digital gauge cluster is, in typical Volkswagen Audi fashion, super customizable as well, and has two hidden quirks that I particularly like, one of which is a boost gauge that I think Volkswagen is using absolute pressure and not actual boost, because it maxes out at almost 40 psi, which doesn't seem super realistic, if I'm honest, as well as a power readout in kilowatts, which I don't think I've ever seen outside of an electric car. However, it is also completely computerized because this car is tuned on E85 and makes about 400 horsepower, but the power gauge maxes out at 180 kilowatts, which if you convert it is 240 horsepower, i.e. the stock output of this car. As much as I love physically driving with this steering wheel, the piano black capacitive touch buttons on it are also really obnoxious to use. Some of them aren't too bad, and I do like that you can swipe or press a lot of them. You have the option there. But my main gripe with them is that most of them are just too close together because they're not individual buttons. The whole panel presses when you push something. And since the touch points are quite close together, when you're trying to adjust your heated steering wheel, you may accidentally change your music track. Or when you're trying to adjust your cruise control, you may accidentally adjust your music volume. It's just not really ideal. Volkswagen did say that they are going back on this setup now, so hopefully that will come in either 24 or 25 model year and just have physical buttons again. Unfortunately, the heads-up display that you get projected on the windshield is also somewhat lacking in my opinion, which is odd given the amount of customization that you have for the digital gauge cluster and other aspects of this vehicle. It just shows you your basic information, which is fine, speed and speed limit in the center, your cruise control and safety information off to the left side, but the right side is reserved for your navigation directions. And the navigation in this car is not linked to Apple CarPlay, meaning that unless you're using the built-in infotainment system, the right side of the heads-up display is constantly just blank, appearing the whole thing to be slightly off-center, which is kind of annoying. Hopping in the back seat of the GTI, while this is nowhere near the amount of space that you get in a Jetta GLI or Hyundai Elantra N, it is still adequate for two adults if needs must. You do have a really nice level of amenities back here, and the whole thing is pretty attractive. You have the same black and gray leather with red stitching as up front, and the front seat backs are particularly nice to look at as well. For some reason, Volkswagen has given you a multitude of storage back here. You have 3 pockets on the back of both front seats, so 6 in total, as well as fairly good sized water bottle bins on both doors. Another nice thing, both outboard rear seats are heated and you have your own climate zone back here. As ever, the GTI is genuinely excellent to drive. The Turbo 4 puts out respectable numbers stock, but is also highly tunable if you so desire. And as previously mentioned, this particular car is tuned on E85 flex fuel, and like I said, makes about 400 horsepower. Which in a corner is useless, but in a straight line, this thing is quite fast, although it does really struggle to put that power down until about third gear. Even in stock form, the GTI wheel hops pretty bad, as I've discovered on another Mark 8 as well as previously a Mark 7. This car also has an APR exhaust on it. I believe it's just a catback, but even in stock form, the exhaust on the Mark 8 is significantly louder than the Mark 7 was, and has a nicer tone to it as well. The built-in sound actor fake sound generator, luckily in this car, is much less overbearing than it is in the Mark 7 Jetta GLI that I reviewed last year. And you can still turn it off in the infotainment system, or just simply unplug it if you really can't stand it. Equipping the DSG automatic in this car yields a full half-second drop in 0 to 60 time, but arguably the manual can be more fun in some situations. Although, to be honest, I feel like with the tune, this car is probably more suited to the DSG with this power level. And speaking of the manual transmission, I alluded to the fact earlier that this is not one of my favorite shifters I've ever used, and nor is it one of my favorite clutches I've ever used. As others have noted in the Mark 8, the clutch is really just not good, frankly. It doesn't have a super easily discernible bite point, and when it does engage, it is quite high up. Both of those things combine to the fact that it's really just kind of difficult to get to grips with. This is a really easy car to stall, which is not a good thing, of course. And the shifter, despite the fact that I love the rubberized golf ball texture and the overall appearance of the shifter, it is a pretty chunky shift knob, it's just kind of sloppy. I mean, granted, I'm comparing it directly to my Mazda Miata, which is probably one of the best manual shifters you'll feel outside of a gated manual in an old Ferrari or something like that. But even compared to a BMW M2, which BMW is typically known for having somewhat sloppy manual transmissions, this one is pretty much just on that level, or honestly even worse. The throws are pretty short, which is nice, but it's just not sharp. And I don't know, I just don't love it. Despite that, however, overall driving pleasure is still top-notch, as the GTI is always renowned for. Versus the Mark 7, Volkswagen has apparently retuned both the electronic limited slip differential as well as the adaptive dampers that the Autobahn trim level features. And understeer is pretty limited. This car, having 21-inch wheels and fairly thin non-factory tires, the handling characteristics are affected slightly by those two things, but in stock form it is perfectly fine. The adaptive dampers are honestly not that different, I don't think, and they're also really not that different between the different driving modes, comfort versus sport and so on. This car still rides fairly rough either way, but not quite as rough as the Jetta GLI in stock form, which is nice. That said, the body itself is still well controlled, and the ride is not bad, it's just very firm. And that is something that Volkswagen, in my opinion, has always really struggled with. It's also really quick. And one of the GTI's hallmarks, of course, is the fact that it's always been an excellent daily driver. I mean, sure, you lose some practicality compared to, say, a Taos small crossover, but for the majority of people that are actually looking at buying a GTI, they probably don't care about that. Rear seat space is still good, and honestly, cargo space is still perfectly fine as well. You get good fuel economy, though not in this particular car on E85, but in a regular 93 octane tuned Mark 7, I was still able to achieve over 40 miles to the gallon on the highway. And honestly, this car, I've still been averaging mid-20s overall, which is not bad for the tune setup that this car is running. Ultimately, my two biggest problems with this car are the interior controls and the fact that I wouldn't personally just be able to justify spending $40,000 on a GTI, because for several $1,000s cheaper, you can get a Hyundai Elantra N, which, yes, does lack some of the features and refinement of this car, but is hilariously fun to drive and insanely good value. At this price point, I would also be tempted by a Mark 7.5 Golf R, because that car in stock form makes more power than this, is also still highly tunable if you want to go that route, and adds all-wheel drive. And frankly, just has better technology on the inside, even though it is a generation older. Although, that said, there's really not much other competition left for the GTI these days. I mean, Ford's hot hatches are completely gone from the US market, and apart from the Civic Si, which is just a sedan, Elantra N, which is also just a sedan, and the Volkswagen Jetta GLI, which is once again a sedan and effectively just the same car as this, every other true performance rival is either an SUV, crossover, or an electric car. So, if you can live with the awful infotainment, the GTI should be still an easy top pick for those looking for a hot hatch daily driver. I mean, just leave the temperature on the same setting forever. Simple enough, right? And with that, that's where I'm going to wrap this video up. As always, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed it or found it informative, give it a thumbs up, and consider subscribing for plenty more content to come.